We're here at the Montgomery County Historical Society. This is the 29th of January, isn't it?
Still is.
1999. Can't even remember the date. And the fellow that's doing our taping here is Mike Hall. He's the executive director of the Montgomery Historical Society. And our interviewee is Jack Roberts, John R. Roberts?
John R. Roberts is the official name.
Yeah, okay. And he's a Robertsville resident, and I'm Bob Wernle. We're doing this tape, and I've cautioned Jack ahead of time that this tape is going to be public property, and it's going to be over there at the Robertsville Public Library, and whatever he says may go down to posterity. So for that reason, he may want to guard what he says, not get anybody living in trouble. And at the start, I think we'll just go with the obvious first question is, when were you born, Jack?
Well, I was born back in 1923, October 15th to be specific, in Jenkintown, Pennsylvania, which is a northern suburb of Philadelphia.
How do you spell that?
Jenkintown. It's about 15 miles from Philadelphia. I grew up there, went to school at Penn Charter School, and then matriculated at the University of Pennsylvania.
Penn Charter, as you just said?
Yeah, William Penn Charter School.
And what is that?
That's a Quaker school.
Oh.
Quaker school. My father was a Quaker. My mother was a more ardent Episcopalian, so I'm not Episcopalian, but I grew up in Quaker schools, and then matriculated at the University of Pennsylvania in the fall of 1941. And the first thing I knew about the Second World War from a personal point of view was on December 7th. The university had a policy of fraternity rushing in the fall of your freshman year. And I had just joined the Beta Theta Pi fraternity, and we were, this was the first day of rushing, and that you were allowed to pledge. And I was very enthusiastic about this decision, and we suddenly heard on the radio that Pearl Harbor had been bombed. And college kind of went downhill from there. I was in the town engineering school at the time, and they got all of us freshmen in an auditorium one morning and promised us that if we signed up for the Army Air Corps, they'd let us finish college. Now, that was in November of 42.
42 it must have been.
Right. And in March of 43, for reasons that I still can't quite comprehend, I would find myself in basic training down in Florida. There was some clause in something I signed that allowed them to call us up under certain circumstances, and those circumstances seem to have taken place. So I went to basic training in Miami Beach, lived at the Sea Isle Hotel, 31st and Collins Avenue on the beach, and have never liked the place since. We moved from there to Augustana College and Theological Seminary in Rock Island,
Illinois.
In something that was called a college training detachment. And I remember mentioning this sometime in John Berry's presence, and he said, I went to Augustana.
Yeah, that's right.
So I was only there about 3 weeks. I think it was kind of a holding pen for cadets as they waited for the system to be able to absorb us. Anyway, 3 weeks, pardon me, 3 weeks later, I found myself in San Antonio, Texas, in the classification center down there. And I guess because of my engineering background at that time.
Classification center, you went through interviews and...
Oh, all kinds of tests, which theoretically were able to sort out your strengths and
weaknesses.
weaknesses.
Where'd you get uniform along the line here?
Well, at this point, you were just a private.
Yeah.
until you were classified, you were a private making $50 a month. And once you became a cadet, which happened at this classification.
Well, no, when you haven't gotten us into the service yet.
Oh, okay.
When you were inducted, were your parents there say goodbye to you, or what happened?
Well, they put us on, my parents came and put us on a train.
Did you have any brothers or?
I had a sister who was 2.5 years younger, was not involved in this
Was
process.
she weeping and?
Not that I recall.
It was a pretty solemn
Yeah.
occasion, though, for most of us when we went into service.
Well, we were loaded on a train, about 350 of us, and it was a coach train,
Yeah.
no Pullman or anything.
Yeah.
So we sat up the whole time between Philadelphia and Miami, Florida.
Yeah.
I remember the train pulled into Savannah, Georgia, and at least at that time.
Did they turn the lights off on the train at night?
Well, they have that little dinky light there at the
Yeah.
end, but you know, when you're just trying to sleep in a train sitting up, it's kind of like riding a Greyhound bus. But the train backed into Savannah, Georgia, I remember, and we were all standing on the platform, crowding around, trying to see what was going on. But can I go back to Texas now?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, I was classified as a navigator and sent to pre-flight school in Ellington, Texas, which is just outside of Houston. This was the summer of 1943, and there was a polio scare in Houston, so we were restricted to the base for the whole summer. We, towards the end of our navigation training there became a need for more bombardiers as opposed to navigators for reasons that I never understood. So those of us that had 20/20 vision were taken out of the navigator pool and reclassified as bombardiers. So on the way to bombardier school, which was the next step in this process, we were sent to Las Vegas, Nevada to gunnery school, which is a very interesting operation. We were there for about 6 weeks and learned to fire the 50 caliber machine guns, which were used in most of the airplanes. And at this base, I didn't know it at the time, but Jack Alexander was stationed there as a flight surgeon. And in subsequent conversations,
That was Dr. S.J. Alexander. He was already a doctor by that time.
oh yeah, he was a doctor then, but obviously a fledgling one. Because one of his chores was, in addition to being a flight surgeon, was mess officer. And he said that he always ate in the cadet mess because we had better food than the rest of the base. Jack, I'm sure, would find that out. Anyway, it was a great thing to be in gunnery school. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Those of you who have seen World War II movies where the Jap Zero was flying around, the movie makers used an AT-6, which is an Army training plane, the one with a long canopy over the 2 cockpits. And we used that in gunnery school. They took that canopy off, and you wore a belt, and you hooked yourself to the side of the airplane, and you stood up with a 50 caliber machine gun mounted on the side of the airplane. And there was another plane flying along, I don't know, a quarter mile away, towing a target. And you shot at the target, and your bullets were colored green, and some other cadets' bullets were red and yellow. And as they entered this target, some of the ink transferred to the target, and they were able to tell how accurate you were. And I never wished that I was flying that airplane towing that target, because some of these cadets were pretty wild and not very competent in firing these guns. But we also had the opportunity there to get into a ball turret on the B-17 and roll around and fire those guns. And I'm glad to say I never wound up in one of those things in combat, because that's a rather isolated position to be in down on the bottom of one of those airplanes. When you crawl in and lock the door, you're down there, and if something happens to the mechanism, you're stuck.
Mm-hmm. That's down in the bottom of the bomber.
The bomber, yeah. This ball turret is inserted up to the bottom of the bomber, and the thing has to be in a closed position in order to be able to land the airplane, because the guns are sticking straight down, which they may be when you're when you're rolling around shooting at people, they would touch the ground before the wheels did. And so that didn't work out very well. Well, after gunnery school, we moved on to Victorville, California, to bombardier school. And this was a, as I recall, a 13-week operation where we learned to use the Norden bombsight. And going back to Las Vegas for just a minute, I remember when
Why don't you tell us about the Norden bombsight so that...
Let me just mention the fact that when we were in Las Vegas at gunnery school, the town was 6 blocks long. And Jack Alexander and I have often discussed the fact that had we bought a few acres of land outside of that city in those days, we would not have had to work as hard as we did in the rest of our lives, but it was not to be. The Norden bombsight was developed prior to the war and was considered to be the most accurate bombsight in use in the war. It had 2 basic parts. There was the base, which was basically a gyro system that made the platform that held the top piece independent of the motion of the airplane, so that you didn't have all the rocking around that took place because of the air currents. And then the top part housed the telescope. And it was the bombardier's chore when you were coming down the bomb run to put the crosshairs in this telescope on the target. And then there were 2 knobs that you adjusted. One cranked the airplane left or right to adjust for any wind drift that was buffeting you at that time. And the other one controlled the speed at which this telescope drove down under the airplane, because as you approached the target, you had to move this thing down to stay on the target. And the adjustment that controlled that moved a little wheel that worked against the spinning disc. And as you moved from the center of this disc to the outside, you increased the speed at which this thing drove, and as you moved it back down, you decreased the speed. And by the time you had reached the target, you hopefully had this adjusted so the crosshairs, without any further adjustment, just stayed there. And then as the telescope drove up, there was a trigger point, and when the top end of the telescope hit that trigger point, the bombs went away. And the way it worked is that there was a lead bombardier using his bomb sight in each of the squadrons, and the other 11 planes in the squadron, flying in formation, when they saw the first bomb go out of the lead plane, would hit a trigger and their bombs would go away, which gave us pattern bombing rather than just random bombing, which the British did in connection with their night bombing. Well, I'm a little ahead of myself. We learned how to use the Norden bombsight in Victorville, and it was really very interesting. We would fly in twin-engine airplanes, 2 students to a plane, and
What were these planes, Jack?
They were Beechcrafts. They were called AT-11s, Advanced Trainer 11. And I don't.
You're on trainers.
You're in trainers.
Okay.
Yeah, but we would fly over targets in the desert, and one of the students would be on the bomb site, and the other one would be peering through a hole in the bottom of the airplane, you know, like a manhole cover you took up. And the other student was back there with a camera. And it was the cameraman's job, when the bomb landed on the ground, it emitted smoke. And it was the cameraman's job to take a picture of that immediately upon impact. And the student in the front would be graded on how close he was to the center of the target. And then you took turns doing this. When you got a little further along in school, you took the time to find out how the wind was blowing, and you could wait a little longer if the wind was going to blow the smoke closer to the target than otherwise. But that was kind of hard to do, and sometimes you lost as much as you gained. But after graduation, well, before I graduated, 2 weeks before I graduated, I got the measles. So they put me in the hospital, and I was taken back a class. My class graduated, and I graduated with a subsequent class.
I got the measles when I was
Did you?
training too. And I had Dr. Oh, what's his name? There was a Crowersville doctor took care of me. I've forgotten what his name. Sam Millis, Dr.
Sam
Millis.
Millis?
No, his father.
Oh, his father.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I was in the contagious ward with the measles, and one of the regulations of the hospital was that before you were discharged, you had to go over and they gave you a Wasserman test. And I went over and to do this, and I said, "Why do I have to take a Wasserman test? I just had the measles." Well, the nurses all burst out laughing. They said, "I'll bet you just had the measles." But anyway, after I graduated from Montgomery School, or from Bombardier School, I was given a 10-day leave to report to Rapid City, South Dakota, to join our combat unit. And in that intervening 10 days, I hitchhiked across the United States on airplanes. Once you were in the Air Corps, you were allowed to do that. You went to an air base and went out to the operations office and sat around until some plane was going in your direction, and if there was room, they let you get aboard. So I remember I flew from someplace in California, and I can't recall just where, to Salt Lake, to Omaha, to Nashville, to Philadelphia. And I don't remember the stops I went through getting back to Rapid City, but nevertheless, it was an inexpensive way to get from point A to point B. We were made up in a cruise in Rapid City, and a B-17 had a pilot, a co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, engineer, 2 waist gunners, a ball turret gunner, and a tail gunner. And we were assigned to all of these crews, and my pilot was married and my navigator was married. They were slightly older than the rest of us. I've stayed in touch with several of these people. My pilot has since had a stroke.
You were not married at the time?
Oh, I wasn't married for quite a while yet.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I was 20 at this point. But I hadn't even thought about getting married because I was just in my 3rd semester at college when I went into the service. But we had a great time in Rapid City. I never will forget how windy it seemed to be out there. We learned to operate this particular airplane. And as part of our chores, I remember going on some navigational trips. One time we flew past the Rushmore Memorial, which was in this basically completed, but not totally so at that time. And it had been raining, and I remember looking out the window of the airplane and seeing the faces, and as a result of the rain, changing the color of the monuments, right underneath their noses it remained dry, and it looked like they had runny noses because it was a different color. And I've mentioned that to several people who have been there since in the rain, and they said, well, they didn't notice it because they were standing down on the ground looking up, and when you fly by at the same level, well, you can tell this. Well, we were made up into our crews, learned how to operate the airplane basically, and were assigned to the 8th Air Force in England. We did not fly our plane over like some people did, since this was now the 2nd quarter of 1994.
You mean 90? Not 94.
44, I'm sorry, yeah. This is 99, isn't it? Anyway, we went to Camp Kilmer, and were subsequently put on a convoy of ships. I think there were about 35 or 6 of them in this convoy. And it took us 2 weeks to get to Liverpool. I bought a pipe, I remember, in the PX just before we left. And I thought my father always smoked pipes, and I thought it was time I learned. Well, by the time I got to England, the end of my tongue was so damn sore. I threw the pipe away and I haven't smoked one since. But our particular crew was assigned to the 600 Squadron of the 398th Bomb Group in the 1st Division. The 8th Air Force was made up of 3 divisions. The 1st and 3rd flew B-17s, and the second flew B-24s, which was the Liberator, another American four-engine bomber. The 600 squadron had, or group had 4 squadrons in it, and on a normal bombing mission, 3 of the 4 would fly, and the 4th one would stand down, primarily to do some maintenance on the airplane and also to give you a kind of a breather in between these trips. We were assigned 3 crews to a Quonset hut. At that time, and I assume it's still true, the officers lived in one section and the enlisted men in another. The pilots and the bombardier and the navigator were officers. So there were 3 groups of 4 in each one of these huts. And normally 2 of the 3 would go on one of the missions. A Quonset hut is a pretty standard thing. Most of us are familiar with them. There's still, well, there's one over here in town. It's called over on Pike Street.
Yeah, I know where it is.
Anyway, we had a potbelly stove in the middle of this thing, which was the heat. And on days when a mission was being flown, they would come in and wake up the crews that were going on that mission about 3 o'clock in the morning. And the one remaining crew, or even if you didn't fly that day and everybody was there, the rules of the hut were that the first guy up in the morning had to go to the coal pile and bring back the kennel coal. So it turned out basically the guy with the smallest bladder was always bringing the coal in. Anyway, when they came and got you for a mission, you went to a briefing room. You were divided into sections, the pilots in one, and the bombardiers in another, and the navigators in the other.
Now, where are you now?
I'm in Nut Hampstead.
Okay, you didn't get it.
Oh, I didn't get you there. Well, okay. When
you were in a convoy. You were.
Okay, we landed in Liverpool,
Okay.
England, and they took us by train to a little town called Royston, which is just south of Cambridge.
Okay.
And from there, they picked us up in these GI trucks and took us to our base in a little town called Nut Hampstead, which I have since been back to, but there's not much there anymore. There's a little chapel and a tavern. And other than that, it has reverted back to turnip fields, which it was before they laid a few strips down and called it an air base. It was actually only active as an air base for about 18 months. And well, anyway, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. At that time, we had the regular crews had to fly 35 missions, at which time they were sent home. And the lead crews flew 30 missions. They arrived at that number, starting those numbers by a mathematical formula which they devised, the Air Corps devised back in 42 and 3. In those days, you only had to fly 25 missions because the average loss of planes on a mission was 4%. And they took this 4% and divided it into 100, and that was the number of missions you had to fly. By the time I was there in 1944, and I flew my first mission in June of that year, the loss rate had decreased to somewhere around 33%. So they adjusted the number of missions you had to fly from 25 up to 35, except for the lead crews, and because of the reasons that I had stated earlier, that
You're talking about lead crews.
They were the ones with the bomb sights that were the targets of the anti-aircraft, and to the extent that you've got fighter attacks, they were normally trying to shoot down the lead crews because that would interfere most with the bombing performance of the squadron. So we were a lead crew, and for that reason I had to fly 30 missions. I finished my tour on December 31st of 1944. On the first mission we went to Munich, Germany. And I remember sitting up front as the bombardier. You were inside the little plexiglass nose looking out the front, and had the best view in the whole plane. And I remember watching all that flak popping around out there. Fortunately, none of us hit it. None of it hit us. And I got home and I thought, well, this isn't too bad.
Yeah.
Well, what I didn't realize is that when it hits you, it's an entirely different ballgame than when just go popping around out there. If anyone is interested in what that's like, I suggest you might want to see 12 O'Clock High. That and another movie called Memphis Belle are about the 8th Air Force and B-17s in particular. 12 O'Clock High had Gregory Peck as a colonel in it, and it's much more realistic. In the Memphis Belle picture, they imagined about everything that happened to any airplane and made it into one movie, and you just can't believe all the things that happened to those guys. But 12 O'Clock High is a pretty authentic piece as to how it was. Fortunately, by the second half of 1944, the Air Corps had developed fighters which had the range to go in deep with us. I'm talking about an 8-hour mission now. They didn't necessarily fly 8-hour missions because they would take off after we did, but they could accompany us, and they protected us from German fighters, which is primarily the reason for that reduction in the loss rate.
Now those fighters, what were the P-38s or what were they?
No, well, some, but basically they were P-51s. The P-38, which was a twin-engine fighter, was the first one to develop that range. And you may remember Lindbergh did a lot of work in extending the range of the P-38 out in the Pacific. At that particular time, he was not exactly thoroughly appreciated by our government because he had been an advocate of Hitler.
Yeah.
And but they did take advantage of his expertise, and he had a lot to do with the development of the range of the P-38. But the P-51 was the airplane that was used primarily to escort us.
Mm-hmm. How's that different from a P-38?
Well, the P-38 has twin engines. A P-51 has a single engine. It's liquid cooled. It's called the Mustang. It's a fine airplane. Young Wilkins had one.
Up in from Linden.
Up in Linden, Clint's son.
Uh-huh.
And he used to keep it out in Colorado. It's a hot airplane.
Mm-hmm.
I think everyone might be interested in how you formed up to go on these missions. On an all-out mission, there would be 2,000 airplanes in line, flying over one or maybe two targets. And it was really an impressive thing to see this. Well, how do you get 2,000 airplanes lined up? In the briefings of the navigators that I have alluded to a few minutes ago, they were instructed as to how this was to happen, and it was their responsibility to get their particular plane in formation. Around and about England were things that they called bunchers, which were navigational towers that transmitted signals in different frequencies, and each of the bomber groups or squadrons was given the frequency that they were supposed to monitor. And four groups would form up in the quadrants around these bunchers, and when you took off, you climbed altitude, let's say 20,000 feet, where the assembly operation took place. The lead planes would go first, and would be the leader and the deputy leader, and they would start flying around in a big circle in their quadrant at this buncher. And as the other planes took off, they would individually come up and drop into their assigned positions. It takes about 20 minutes to fly a 360-degree circle with a group of airplanes of that size. Since it was essential that you reach a point on the coast of England called the departure point, the navigator really had to work quite hard to make certain that when that appointed time came, you were there. And since the circle took 20 minutes, you really had to pay attention to what you were doing and be right on the numbers each time, or you were out of sequence when you got there, and it was mass confusion. And so you would form up, and the bomber stream would leave England at a specific point on the coast, heading towards Europe. And you would be strung out. It'd take hours for these 2,000 bombers to go across any one point. You had to go on oxygen when you reached 10,000 feet. That's because you start to get a little fuzzy in your thinking if you're not on oxygen much above that area, that altitude.
You had your oxygen.
You had an oxygen mask, and there were oxygen bottles in the airplane. In that connection, when people think of an oxygen bottle, they think of a hard steel cylinder. In this case, they were large cylinders, so they could accommodate as much oxygen as the small ones, but at a much lower pressure, so that if they received a hit, they didn't blow up. They just evacuated the oxygen into the atmosphere without destroying the airplane. But anyway, you went on oxygen around 10,000 feet, and left the coast in your assigned position. During all of this, the bombardier didn't have very much to do, and the gunners were just kind of relaxing, making sure that their guns were ready. And but after you left the coast, everyone fired their guns to make sure that they operated correctly, and then you waited, and you.
Was there a particular part of the English coast that you took off from?
Well, depending on where you were going. If you were going to Berlin, for example, it would be further east than it would if you were going to Munich.
So the destinations were varied from time to time?
Very well. I happened to go to one target 6 times, but that was most unusual. You never knew where you were going to go until you went to the briefing that morning. And then you went by truck out to your individual planes.
Who would give the briefing? What did?
Well, there were what we called ground pounders, administrative people who had spent...
They were not flyers.
They were not flyers, no.
They were...
They were administrative officers who had received the bombing mission information over teletype. It came in sometime after midnight, and they assembled it into the various units, the navigator, pilots, and bombardier information, and transmitted it to us. And I remember sitting there, and if they said you were going to Berlin, there was a great oh. And if they said you were going to some small town that nobody ever heard of, the assumption was that the target would not be as well protected as say Berlin, and they were called milk runs, the easy ones. They didn't always turn out that way, but that was the term that was assigned to a mission that didn't appear to be too...
Some missions were, though, like Munich would have been quite a bit more farther away.
Yeah. Some of them were 8 hours long. And that was one of the reasons that the airplane was so valuable. It could go those distances. It only flew at 160 miles an hour, but it got you there, and in many, many instances, it was able to bring you home, even though it was shot up rather badly because it was a tough critter. You would, pardon me, you flew along looking for fighters, gradually reaching your assigned altitude, which was in the B-17 somewhere between 24 and 26,000 feet. And you flew to an IP, which was the initial point. This was normally about 50 miles from the target. And as you could do evasive action or whatever was considered necessary to avoid the flak, up until you got to this IP point, at which point the pilot turned the airplane on the assigned heading. Let's say you were going east, and that was 90 degrees, and locked on the automatic pilot, and the bombardier took over flying the airplane. It was the pilot's responsibility to see that the airplane maintained a constant airspeed. Because if you remember back to my mentioning how the bombsight worked, if the assigned number was 160 knots, for example, and he flew 165, then the bombsight was unable to compute properly, and you would miss the target. So he had to hold the thing on a fixed airspeed. And by then the navigator had given you the wind directions up there, giving you the bombardier, and you were able to put this information into the bomb sight so that when the pilot turned on the automatic pilot and the bomb sight took over, you turned these knobs and the airplane actually turned left and right. And you flew a straight line from that initial point to the target. Well, at 150 miles an hour, 50 miles, you're doing this for about 20 minutes. And this is when the anti-aircraft fire became most intense, because their radar had pretty closely identified your altitude, which they refined over the course of 2,000 airplanes going by, or some lesser number on smaller missions. And in addition to that information, they had in some shells proximity things that if they got next to your airplane, they exploded. And they didn't just have to hit you.
Those were late developing, weren't they?
Yeah, they were. But they had a gun called an 88, which was a beautiful piece from their point of view. They also had the 88 millimeter. They also had 105s, and I remember over Nuremberg one time when there was this huge explosion out in front of us, and one of the more experienced people said that was a 155, and that was a real shell. But anyway, you went down this IP, and until those bombs went away and the airplane jolted up when the bombs were released, the loss of weight, at which time the pilot took over and could do evasive action, getting you out of there, which everybody highly approved of at that point. And then you had a prescribed route home. So it was very.
Well, there would be only one bomb drop.
From each airplane.
Once your bombs were down, you were done.
You were done.
Okay.
You were done. Yeah. Occasionally, there would be what we call an aborted mission, and you would have to get rid of your bombs. In other words, the mission was called off for some reason or other. You had to get rid of your bombs before you could land, and that usually took place over the North Sea. And that didn't happen very often, but on occasion it was important to get rid of them because you couldn't land with them. You now find commercial airplanes flying around to use up gas before they try to land, because if they can't land with a full load of gasoline, you just blow the tires and ruin the undercarriage of the airplane. That's what they were doing up there in Labrador when that Swiss airplane went down there.
Oh, yeah.
Remember, they were trying to get rid of some fuel.
Yeah, getting rid of the fuel.
In that case, it didn't work out very well, but anyway. Well, I mentioned Munich and Nuremberg. I went to Cologne 6 times. Which brings me to...
you see the cathedral?
I saw the cathedral sometimes, and sometimes I didn't, and that's the
How
reason...
did you miss it?
Well, that's the reason I bring it up. There's no question but the Norden bomb sight was a very accurate instrument for that time, and assuming it was used properly, you weren't going to hit the cathedral. But out of my 6 missions to Cologne, I recall that about 3 of them were with 10-tenths conditions. That means that you had a complete cloud cover underneath you and you couldn't see anything. Well, they had a radar developed at that point which could give you the outline of the city, and the same kind of tracking device that the Norden bomb sight had told you when to release the bombs. But believe me, it was not accurate enough to miss the cathedral when everybody was just going over. So the good Lord had a hand in taking care of that cathedral. Yeah. And it really escaped.
Yeah, it's amazing.
It absolutely is. I mean, the other thing is, we take credit for not destroying it, but believe me, there were other factors involved. During the Battle of the Bulge, the 8th Air Force, which is basically a strategic bombing group, that means that you were going in after factories as opposed to attacking troops, which was a tactical operation, like the 12th Air Force flying twin-engine bombers did. But we were diverted from our strategic missions to assist the troops break out of the Battle of the Bulge, and in one particular mission we went to Caen, that's C-A-E-N in France, and bombed based on smoke bombs released by the troops on the ground. Well, as I had mentioned earlier, smoke blows around in the wind, and this particular day, although no one knows for obvious reasons who was responsible as a result of the smoke roaring around, we killed General McNair. We, the 8th Air Force bombs, killed General McNair, who was on the ground.
Oh my gosh.
And it was just, you know, one of those things. But at that particular mission, we were 12,000 feet in altitude, which was totally different for us. And believe me, at 12,000 feet, the ground goes by a lot faster.
Yeah.
Apparently a lot faster than it does when you're with 25,000 feet.
Well, tell us about going over Berlin.
I never went to Berlin.
You never did?
I never did. I was on a mission. They occasionally sent out squadrons as a diversionary action. If they were going to target A, they would also send some squadrons off to a target B, just to try to lure the fighters to attack the lesser of these groups. But other than a diversionary action at Berlin, I never did go there. It was just, you know, luck of the draw. You woke up that morning and you went, or you didn't go, as the case may be.
What about Nuremberg?
The thing I remember about Nuremberg, other than the fact that it was a fur piece, was it was 55 degrees below zero in that airplane. The B-17 had no heating system other than an electrical system. We all wore electric flying suits, and we had the option to wear electric boots, which were like slippers that you plugged into the leg of your bib overall type thing you had on underneath your jacket. I always chose to wear my GI boots because if you had to jump or were shot down on the ground for any other reason, I didn't want to find myself walking around Germany in bedroom slippers. And so there I was at 55 below with a pair of fleece-lined boots on over my shoes, but believe me, it was pretty cold. That and that 155 shell that went off were my two remembrances of Nuremberg. Fortunately, I was never wounded. Our plane was obviously hit several times. We did lose our co-pilot. After about 10 missions, he was made a first pilot and was given his own crew. This was a constant reshuffling of crews as people were wounded or transferred home or became ill, got the measles or whatever. And he was shot down, and we never heard what happened to him. One of the things that you did as you were flying along is you paid attention to the planes around you, and when you landed you went to a debriefing. Again, pilots, navigators, bombardiers in separate rooms, and one nice thing about it, they always gave you 2 ounces of scotch when you landed. But we never did find out where our co-pilot's team or crew wound up, but you reported what you saw in terms of airplanes being knocked out of formation and the condition and whether you saw parachutes and so on and so forth. And that information was all compiled and hopefully guided people in finding out what happened to their friends and relatives. And it rather unpleasant to come back to a hut one time and realize that one of the other 2 crews in your hut weren't coming back. And, but you know.
When you come back, Jack, you of course you've gotten a lot of flack. And you looked at the airplane, would you see damage to the airplane?
Yeah, you did. One of the nice things about the B-17 is it was an air-cooled engine. I mentioned the P-51, which was liquid-cooled. Unfortunately, if you took a hit in the cooling system and the liquid ran out, you had nothing to do but jump out because the airplane was going to catch fire in a very short period of time. But the air-cooled engines on a B-17 could continue to run even if you blew one of the cylinders off. It was kind of a rough ride. You can imagine if your car only had 5 cylinders or 7 as opposed to the 6 or 8. But the thing continued to run. In many instances, it was really a very well-designed airplane. You could lose an engine, the biggest, and still fly. You could lose 2 engines and still fly. You could fly with 1 engine, but you kept losing altitude when you got less than 3, at least with the 17. But the big problem was that if you lost an engine, you could no longer maintain your position in formation. And the whole idea behind the formations was that if a fighter attacked, you had the firepower of all the airplanes around you in addition to your own to shoot at this fighter. But you let a bomber drift out of the bomber string, and he's down here all by himself. And they really jumped right on you. And so that it was certainly less than desirable to lose an engine.
Did any of your flights, any of these planes land in foreign territory?
Oh yeah, some of them landed in the North Sea. If you were crippled, you normally didn't put your wheels down, particularly if you were landing in a cornfield or something. But a lot of them, you tried to get back to England after the occupation had started. There were places in France that you could land and not be captured. But in addition to that, there were huge airfields that were maybe a half an hour, or airstrips that were about a half a mile wide and 5 miles long. There were 3 of them in England. And they were put down there so that if your pilots were killed, about any dummy can bring in an airplane on a thing that size, because you have such great tolerance in terms of how you come down. A B-17 was a tricycle airplane, and contrary to the jets that you fly in today where they power them in, you're under full power when you land, these things you'd come in over the runway and you'd chop the engines, pull the throttles off, and you kind of float down and land. That's a little more difficult to engineer, particularly if you're not used to it. That's why they had these huge airfields, so that anybody could land on them if they could get the airplane back there. And it was quite possible that your pilots could be killed and yet the airplane could still fly. Not very desirable, but...
And of course, if you got dumped in the North Sea, that was the end of it, or the channel.
You had, they told us 20 minutes. And then hypothermia caught up with you. We did have rafts, but you know, if you were shot at badly enough to land in the North Sea, it's quite likely that the rafts might have had a hole in them too. So, but you just, you know, there was not much time before. If they didn't get to you, forget it.
Yeah. Now, were there planes back there in England looking for that were assigned to this job?
Well, the British had an air sea rescue squadrons that were in the North Sea. The English Channel really isn't very big, you know. And if you could get that far, the possibility of being picked up was pretty good. Yeah. But you got to remember that there were German fighters buzzing around, and they didn't care whether you dropped your bombs or not. If they could prevent you from coming back another day, well, they were just happy to do that.
Yeah. Did you notice any, over the course of time, did the German Air Force gradually, were there fewer and fewer?
Oh, there were far fewer, yeah. In other words, when I was flying, fighters were nowhere near the problem they were earlier. And I was very lucky that, you know, none of them had any success with us.
Now, one of the targets that you mentioned earlier was Munich.
Yes.
Tell us about Munich.
Well, it's a long way down. I remember looking at the Alps mountains when we were over Munich, and thinking, you know, there's Switzerland right down there. And that was, if you landed, incidentally, in that part of the world, you tried to get to Switzerland as fast as you could, because if you got there, they didn't turn you over. But as I mentioned earlier, that was my first mission. I can't recall what the targets were. This was, you know, back 50-some years ago. And while I have a list of the places we went, I can't recall whether it was a marshalling yard, which was a railroad operation, or
That was, of course, that was a railroad center.
yeah.
And
You spent a lot of time trying to disrupt the transportation system of Germany.
and a lot of times those railroad cars were full of GI prisoners.
Well, I guess, but that, frankly, that wasn't
Well,
anything we could worry about.
yeah.
They were certainly full of prisoners on their way to some of the concentration camps.
Yeah. Okay, well, what were some of the other targets that you...
Many little towns. Strasbourg was one. That's right on the border of France and Germany. I mentioned we went to Cologne 6 times. Went to Eindhoven once. I remember
To where?
Eindhoven in Holland.
Oh, I know.
We were after the Philips factory there, and
What's Philips? Is that
it's a big electronics company.
Yeah, that's the same company.
Yeah,
It's still
same
around.
company, still in business.
Yeah.
And I remember in subsequent years I was working for Sylvania Electric, and a group of Philips people came over on a visitation, and I happened to mention that I had bombed Eindhoven, and they said, "Oh yes," they remembered. But that was considered a milk run, not because it wasn't well protected, but it was so short. And you know, a 6-hour mission is a lot shorter than an 8-hour mission. And, you know, well, after my 30 missions, I came home again by boat. This time I was sent home on the Ile-de-France, and those larger ships with their greater speeds were sent.
How could, you know, I went over on the Ile-de-France to the Pacific.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, how did you get over where you were?
Well, in January of '44, it was in England.
Well, I was in 42.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you didn't use it up.
Oh,
Well, you remember the darn thing sank in its
Yeah.
berth there in New York.
yeah.
But anyway, we came booming home in 4.5 days, as opposed to the 2 weeks it took us to go over in convoy. And we had a 30-day rest and rehabilitation thing, at which point we all were supposed to report again to Miami Beach. At that time, I applied to go to pilot school. Having sat up there in a non-operating position as far as that airplane was concerned for 30 missions, I wanted to be in control of the thing. And so I applied for pilot school and was accepted, and was sent from Miami to Big Spring, Texas, which is out in the western part of Texas. And the only reason I mention this place is that we were in the lunch line one time. I can't recall the day, but it was the day that the news came over the radio that we bombed Hiroshima. And here you are with a whole bunch of former combat people. I must confess, absolutely delighted, not having any appreciation of what had happened, but assuming that this was going to shorten the war. And I remember a great round of applause went up in the mess hall. The fact that we had something new, and in all probability it was going to affect our lives, as I think it really did. Well, I was sent to Lancaster, California for primary, and learned to fly Stearmans, which is a twin-engine or a single-engine biplane. A very interesting little airplane. They're the was a fleet up over Chinook Field in Illinois. And they're just great for acrobatics. After completing primary, I went to basic training in Bakersfield.
You're still an enlisted man.
No, I'm a first lieutenant at this point.
Okay, but what are you doing in basic training?
Well, you had to go through the process. In other words, there were cadets in our group, but there were about 30 of us who were back from our combat missions who applied for pilot school. And believe me, that's the way to go through pilot training as an officer.
Okay.
It beats the hell out of being a cadet. But I got to Bakersfield, and they gave us, if you were less than 6 feet tall and weighed less than 200 pounds, you had the option of going to fighter school. If you were over those dimensions, you wound up in bomber training, twin engine versus single engine. Well, again, I liked the mobility of those fighters, having watched them flip around out there, and so I applied for fighter school and was transferred to Stewart Field, which is the airfield at West Point. My travel papers called for me to leave California on what turned out to be VJ Day. And I remember thinking long and hard about whether I was going to miss all that celebration, which was really just getting started out there about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, or get on that damn train. Well, I thought, you know, I'm going to West Point. If I show up late, they'll really crucify me. So I got on the train. The super chief on his way to Chicago. And I will never forget the Santa Fe Railroad in its infinite wisdom closed the bar car. Well, what that meant was that anybody on the train that had a bottle broke it out. And the railroad lost total control of this train. It was a circus all the way to Chicago. I got to Stewart Field, and shortly after arriving there, they called us, 27 of us in, and said, you fellows are going to have to sign up for 3 years or we're going to quit spending money on you and you're going to have to get out. Well, I think 3 of them signed up and the rest of us said, sayonara. And about a week later, well, I was a civilian again. I remember several things that I have omitted as I went along. The Air Corps had a rule that if you did not fly for 90 days, you lost what was called flight pay. Now, as long as you were flying, you received a half of your base salary as a bonus. Well, that was a fairly substantial amount of money, and as a result of my trip home on the boat and going through this R&R and all this transfer and reassignment process, I got down to about 85 days and I had not flown. Now, the only way I could get any flying time was to fly as a passenger in airplanes that student pilots were flying. And one of the dumber things I ever did was to spend 12 hours. I had to have 4 hours for each of the 3 months that I had not flown, sitting in the back of an airplane shooting night landings with student pilots out there in Big Spring, Texas. In retrospect, it just didn't make any sense. But I'm here, so I survived, although some of those guys would come in and hit that landing and you would bounce. It was really something. But
now, did you, going back, any other immediate members of your family in the service?
No. I had mentioned that my father was a Quaker. Mm-hmm. And in the First World War, I don't think the term conscientious objector was in the parlance at that time. But I know he had some special assignment with the government making speeches about something. And I mentioned also I had a sister who was not involved in the service at all. Mm-hmm. And but as a result of our age difference, she got out of college before I did, because she, like Dean, went to school all through the war.
Yeah. Now, did you do any bonding with any of the people that you were with, that you served with?
The people on our crew, I still correspond with the pilot, and he stopped by here. I've never been down to Alabama where he lives, The navigator and I have had dinner together on occasions. He lives down in Germantown, Tennessee, which is outside of Nashville. One of my gunners called the other day. He lives someplace in Pennsylvania, and he wants me to go to the annual reunion that the 8th Air Force holds. I frankly have never been big on these things.
Where are you going to meet?
Well, in this particular year, it's going to be in Harrisburg, which is near where he lives.
Yeah.
And
Our outfit's going to be in Peoria next year.
well, I just
I won't be
considered
going.
that a part of my life, which I did because the country needed us, and I have never participated in those things. But I got a call the other day from a guy who was in my graduating class, Bombardier school. He now lives in Colorado, and he and I happened to wind up at the University of Pennsylvania. Me going back, and he as a newcomer after the war. I don't know whether because we were friends in the service in Rapid City or not, but anyway, we were fraternity brothers. And he called from Golden, Colorado, said he'd seen my name in one of the University of Pennsylvania things, and wanted to know that he was still alive, and so was I, and why didn't we get together? So we're going to Colorado in a couple of weeks, and hopefully we'll be able to touch base
with him.
Yeah, and but I'm involved in one little thing at the moment. As I mentioned, I had the measles and dropped out of my class and graduated with a subsequent class. When you were assigned in the service, you were listed alphabetically, at least in our units. And I often wondered, the guy behind me alphabetically in my original Bombardier class moved up, and he got all the assignments that I would have had if I hadn't gotten the measles. And I got to wonder whatever happened to that guy. Did he survive the war? Well, I called Warren Rutledge the other day. I said, how do you find out about a guy who's in the service? So he gave me the name of a fellow in Ed Pease's staff in Washington. So I've written to this guy and given him the name and all the information I have on this guy. And he was in the airplane seat that I would have been in if I hadn't gotten the measles. And I was just curious as to how he made out. Well, I don't know yet. But
Jack, you've gone through this whole thing, and you haven't mentioned ever being on KP yet.
Oh, I was on KP, yeah. As a cadet, you did KP. But you know, there again, you learn. And I learned on KP, if somehow or other you get a hold of a broom, you could always appeared to be doing something.
Never peeled potatoes?
Well, no, you didn't peel potatoes. Hell, they had tumbling things that peeled potatoes.
Yeah.
You know, with a whole lot of little spikes in them, and they just tumbled around.
When I first went in there, peeled potatoes.
Well, you were 42. I wasn't. We've made progress in the years since then. But no, one thing I do remember doing was as a cadet scrubbing the lobby of the Sea Isle Hotel with a toothbrush. They gave you all these inane things to do. One of the other things you remember is, boy, were you in good shape. In other words, we had calisthenics for 45 minutes out there in the sun, and you were doing one, and the instructor was showing you what the next was going to be, and he'd go left 2, and you'd go into the next one, and then you'd run 5 miles.
Jogging.
Jog. Well, you know, you had to get back by so many minutes, or you know, you were not considered doing your chores.
Did you ever bayonet drill?
No, I didn't have any of that. See.
Did you ever fire a rifle?
Well, only at gunnery school. In gunnery school you shot a lot of skeet as well as machine guns.
Yeah. You didn't use an M1 though or anything like that?
No. As a bombardier, I packed a .45 pistol because you were supposed to destroy the bomb site.
Yeah.
Although, frankly, it was kind of academic by the time I got there. In other words, by 44 they obviously had one, but they didn't have the ability to make it.
Did who were your commanding officers? Did you ever know who they were, or ever see them or anything?
Believe me, I started to fly as a second lieutenant. I was promoted to a first lieutenant, and I never talked to anybody bigger than a captain.
Yeah.
You know, colonels were totally out of my reach.
Okay, why don't we have a recess here? Okay. See where we are on the tail again.
Go ahead.
Jack, you mentioned something we didn't hear about before, and that was you were there when the buzz bombs were coming over. Tell us about that.
Well, the Germans had developed two weapons that they thought were going to turn the tide of the war. One was the buzz bomb, and if you're interested in seeing one, there's one on the town square down in Greencastle. This was really a bomb with wings, and it had a little small engine in it. It sounded like a lawnmower, and it flew, I don't know, 1,000, 2,000 feet, not very high. And they aimed it, and then in terms of when it was going to land, they put a certain amount of fuel in it based on the distance they wanted it to go. And when it ran out of fuel, it dived into the ground. And London was the primary target. And London's a pretty big place area-wise. And these things were flying over there with great regularity, both night and by day. The British Fighter Command.
Where were you when? Were you in London?
Well, we got to go to London after, you know, I think every 6 missions or something. We got a 3-day leave or something, and you went to London. I mean, I spent some time in Cambridge, but basically you went to London. The British Fighter Command developed a technique. They had a fighter plane called a Tornado, I believe. Anyway, it was quite fast, and these buzz bombs weren't all that fast. And these guys would fly up beside this buzz bomb and stick their wing in underneath its wing and flip it, and the thing would go like this and land in a cornfield somewhere. Well, they didn't catch them all, and particularly at night. And these things would come crashing down in the neighborhoods indiscriminately. I was, during the intermission here, talking about a situation I was in London one day. I was having my trousers repaired in a tailor shop and was sitting in a little booth while they were working on my trousers, and you hear these things coming over, and as long as you could hear them, you didn't worry. But this one went silent, and everybody knew something was going to happen. And I dove under a table in this tailor shop, and kerboom, it landed right outside there somewhere. Fortunately, nobody in the shop was injured. But it was this randomness that drove people crazy. I mean, under all-night bombing attack, he got down to the subway, but you couldn't do that with these things. The other instrument they had was what they called the V2, which was really the first rocket. And von Braun, who subsequently was very active in our rocket program down in Alabama. I forget the name of that town down there.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Tullahoma or somewhere.
Yeah, just south of Tennessee. He helped develop this thing, and it took off from Peenemünde, which was on the north coast of Germany, right there by the North Sea, and it would go up into the stratosphere and back down on London or other places. But they never had enough of these to really make much of a difference.
Well, no, you said that you didn't worry if you heard them, but if you didn't hear them, you...
Well, you had to have heard them and then suddenly realize that they quit.
Yeah.
I mean, if you didn't hear them at all, why that you just went on about your business, and you become a little blasé about that kind of stuff. And
did you ever go down in the subway during those attacks?
no, I never did. The mass attacks that the Battle of Britain took place before, and the German Air Force had been destroyed bomber-wise, and they just had isolated raids when I was over there. You know, you got to remember that the British really think the war ended when Montgomery beat Rommel at El Alamein, and that was what, 42, as I recall, and that the rest of this thing was just a cleanup program. And I think they're probably right that inevitably the thing had turned, and shortly, well, sometime in mid-42, the thing had changed, and Hitler never had a chance to win, but he kept on for quite a while.
Jack, obviously the World War II was an important part of your life, but you had an afterlife too. What happened after the war?
Well, first of all, let me say that one thing they did as part of your flying regimentation is that every 6 missions, in addition to this 3-day leave, you got an air medal. So I have 5 air medals. And you got them for just surviving. It was, you know, kind of one notch ahead of the good conduct medal. But anyway, okay. Well, I got out of the service on October 12th, 1945. The University of Pennsylvania had, during the war, gone to a 3-semester system. So I was fortunate in being able to get back into school the 1st of November. And at this point in my life, I decided I didn't want to be an engineer. I probably wasn't going to be a very good one anyway, so I transferred to the Wharton School, and
Wharton,
which is the business school.
Yeah.
And graduated at the end of summer school in 1947. And I got one job offer that time, and I took it. And I wound up in Buffalo, working for Colonial Radio, which was a subsidiary of Sylvania Electric. And was there for about 3 years. Really liked the town, nice place. And then was transferred to the Industrial Relations headquarters in New York City. Worked there for about 8 months, and was transferred to the Electronics Division, Sylvania's Electronics Division in Boston.
What did you do with, what type of work were you doing?
Well, the job offer that I took was employment manager for this radio firm, Colonial Radio, that made auto radios and home sets. And so I was coming up through the Industrial Relations channel. When I was sent to the Electronics Division, I was the assistant personnel manager, and my boss was called up in the service. He was a Marine, and sent to Korea. So I got his job while he was away, and he was gone about a year, and came back and quite properly got his job back. And at that point, the general manager appointed me his assistant, and I was assistant to the general manager. And you have no idea how important that little 2-letter word is, because the difference between assistant to the general manager and being assistant general manager is huge. And in a sense, I was his prep boy. I did the things that he wanted me to do. And I remember I was so frustrated having the responsibility but not the authority. I developed an ulcer at that time. And all my life I haven't had one since, but I got one then. And so I got a little tired of this business, and he allowed me to go to work in manufacturing. And so I was then in charge of their semiconductor operation, which was in its infancy back in those days, and we made diodes and out of germanium and silicone. And then the Korean War came along, and in Seneca Falls, New York, Sylvania made television picture tubes. And they wanted to have an operation out there they could transfer engineers into in case they got drafted. So they picked up the hydrogen thyrotron operation, which was part of the Electronics Division, and moved it to Seneca Falls. And I moved out there to run that operation. And was there during the Korean War. And the day the war ended, they suddenly didn't want any more thyrotrons. This thyrotron, incidentally, is a trigger tube that fires the radar that sends out the impulse. It fires the magnetron that sends out the impulse in the radar system. And so we were about to be, at this point I was married. And
oh, word.
Forgot about that.
Where did you meet your wife, and Who was she?
All right, my wife was Barbara Parker, better known as Dean, and she grew up around the corner from where I lived in Jenkintown. And her father was a doctor. He was our family doctor, and she and I had known each other for forever. I was in second grade, and she was in kindergarten, and we went to a carpool to school. Well, our lives separated when I changed schools in third grade. And while we continued to see each other, it was not anything romantic at that point, but when I would come home to visit my parents from Buffalo and from New York, I'd always say, "Who's around?" And so she was around, and she and I got together, and we were subsequently married. I proposed to her at my sister's wedding, which she always thought was a pretty romantic thing. But anyway, we got married and lived in Boston on Park Drive, which is right on the Fenway. We had a Victory Garden out there in the Fenway, and I remember the apartment we lived in was one of the older ones, and it had a bathtub with lion's feet. And Dean, being the gardener that she was even in those days, started little broccoli seeds in a flat underneath the tub. They're supposed to be in the dark or something. And we subsequently took these out and planted them in our garden. And it came time to harvest the broccoli. And I don't know, we had 10, 12 plants or something. And I went out there and found that somebody had gotten there the day before, and they were all gone, cut them right off at the base. We had corn, and I'm a great believer in the fact that corn is sugar when it's first picked, and it turns into starch very shortly. And we would put the pot on and go out and pick 2 or 3 or 4 ears of corn, put them right in the pot, and eat them. Well, we had 2 children born in Boston, John and Paul. And when I was transferred to Seneca Falls, during that Korean War incident that I referred to, our 3rd child was born in Geneva, Chuck. And then since we were going to be transferred for the 5th time in 8 years, I decided I'd look for a company that didn't have so many plants, and joined P.R. Mallory in Indianapolis, which at that particular time, it was the headquarters for P.R. Mallory, and they subsequently went on to have additional plants, but I was with them for 8 years in the metallurgical division. And the last assignment I had there was president of a small subsidiary of powder metallurgical operation that they had down on the south side of Indianapolis. I was there for the last couple of years. I was with them. And then friends of mine in Indianapolis bought Plastine from American Thermos. Plastine is an injection mold company in Crawfordsville, as you know, although you know as a different name now. And at that time, Trev Kramer, who was one of the founders of Plastine, was with American Thermos and was out of the circle, so to speak. But Vern Walden was president of Plastine. He and the Johnston brothers had a disagreement, and he left, and they asked me to come over and be president of Plastine, which I did. This was in 1964. Vern, at that point, started a company called Ingres over on Lane Avenue, and Ingres being re-entry into the plastic business as far as he was concerned. He was a great injection molding man, and designed the first refrigerated molds that made what we now know as coffee can lids. Those things that come on the top of cans, and when you open the can, you put this lid on. And
that was Vern
Vern started those.
Oh.
Yeah. And anyway, I was with Plastine from 62, I said 64, it was 62. From 62 until 66. And we'd all reached the conclusion that the return on assets employed in the injection molded business, particularly the custom injection molding business, wasn't all that it should be. And so the Johnson brothers sold the company. They sold it to Trev Kramer and Vern Walden. And while Vern and I always got along, they certainly didn't meet me around there anymore when they came back. So at that point, I left Plastine, which was now renamed Ingres Plastine, and joined Ken Crawford at Crawford Industries over on a building that Les Summer owned on Lane Avenue, and which Ingres had been in. So you keep meeting yourself going around the corner in a small town like this. So I was with Ken for 21 years, and we both retired in 1987.
What did you do? What business was that?
Well, Ken in 1959 had decided that he wanted to make book covers, and he had originally thought that these would be hardbound books that Norden would be a major purchaser of the covers, and he started an extrusion business. He bought a used extruder that had been used to make hula hoops.
Hula hoops.
Do you think everybody watching this thing knows what a hula hoop is? But anyway, he converted it to a sheet extruder and was making flat sheet, which was subsequently die cut and hinged. The material was polyethylene, and this is a polymer that has long involved molecules, and as a result you can, assuming you hinge it across the grain, it has grain just like wood or paper, but if you hinge it or cross grain, it then can be flexed, and he developed the polyethylene ring binder.
This took some scientific knowledge.
It really did. He was a crack engineer, a Purdue graduate, and was one of the real entrepreneurs who started this little company. And I joined him in December of 1966. And in 1974, some local investors built the plant out on the Darlington Road. And we leased that and moved in. We subsequently bought that plant from them, the facility itself. And it's amazing how other people impact on your lives. We were able, as a result of work that Will Hayes had done when he was mayor, in enticing Inland Container to come to Crawfordsville and build their plant out there. When that plant was constructed, they had to have a railway delivery system. So a spur was built across the farmland out there to service the inland plant. And the location of the building which we leased was such that we built a little bitty spur off that, and we were able to receive our materials by railroad car, which significantly reduced the transportation cost. Where was I?
You were talking about your association with Ken and the business.
Well, by the time he and I left the company, we had 8 extruders, and it had grown into about $12 million a year operation.
Oh, tell you that there's another thing that you haven't mentioned. You got into the ink business too.
Oh yes.
About that.
Well, polyethylene, in order to increase the margins on the products that we sold, and we sold for resale. In other words, we sold to other binderies and the brokers who sold it, had gotten the orders from the end user. But in order to get some decent margins, as opposed to making a product that you sold through the chain stores or something, Ken had developed a silk screening process, which was most difficult on polyethylene, because the polyolefins nothing will stick to them in their natural state. So you had to put an oxygen molecule into the surface, and you can do this with either flame or electricity. And in the early stages, we were passing it under a flame to do this. But even when you had done that, you had to use, when we first started this, an epoxy ink. An epoxy ink is ink that's made up of two parts, and you mix the two parts together. Most of us are familiar with epoxy glues. And we found, using this epoxy ink, that we were throwing away more ink than we were actually putting on the covers themselves. So for some time we were searching for an ink that would adhere to polyethylene. And I forget how we came by Norm Walcott's name, but he was a young chemist in the Chicago area who had developed an ink that did just this. Only in order to cure it, in other words dry it, you had to pass it under ultraviolet light. And you could just pass this decorated cover under the ultraviolet light, and then you could put another one on top of it. In other words, it was dry enough to do that. It totally revolutionized the business from our decorating point of view. Well, we started to buy ink from him, but he did not have the facilities to make it to meet our delivery requirements. So we struck a deal with him and set up an ink plant here in town. He licensed us and gave us his formulas, and we established the plant over on, I forget what it's called, but it's now where Nautilus is, on the east side of town. And we were in that building for a couple of years. We made and used the ink, and then we got permission from Walcott to sell the ink. And the agreement we had was that we could sell ink for people to use on flat surfaces, and he retained the rights to sell ink on all other surfaces. Well, other surfaces are beer cans, soap bottles, you name it. So we did, and then we found out that what we were doing was teaching all of our competitor customers to use this ink. So they no longer needed our expertise, and we said, well, this is ridiculous. So we gave up the license and gave him all of the facilities that we had established out here, which frankly weren't all that great. And he has subsequently gone on to develop his company, Norcoat, and it's down on the old Lafayette Road.
Yeah.
And he's doing quite well, sells internationally, and I assume that Crawford is still a customer, although I haven't been there for, that was my 12th year.
The Topco, was that,
Well,
what happened to
okay.
Crawford Industries?
Ken and I are approaching 65, and what are we going to do with this thing? Between us, we had 8 children, and that's a bit much to divide it up evenly. And none of them had really expressed any great interest in running the company. In my case, I had told them all that they weren't going to, and they better go make other plans. But anyway, in 1984, we sold the company to a company, Scheller Globe, in Toledo. They are primarily known as a school bus manufacturer, but they had the Globe Warnicke division, which is an old stationary operation. Just about everybody at one point or another had those file things that you used to stack and had glass doors that you opened and closed. But anyway, they were in the stationary business. And they made us part of that particular division. And we each had 3-year contracts. And at the end of 1987, Ken in June and me in December retired and left the company. In the interim, before those retirements, they had sold the Globe Warnicke division to a TAPCO, which is American Trading and Production Company in Baltimore. And the operation in Crawfordsville is now called a TAPCO. And as far as I know, it's doing quite well. They have,
I thought they were going out of business.
No. What?
What do we hear? something.
In the paper recently, it said that they were selling part of their operation. They did. When we were made part of the Global Warnicki operation, there was also a plant owned by them in Chicago, and they made vinyl binders. Now, a vinyl binder is 2 pieces of vinyl heat sealed over chipboard, and it is the binder that most of you think of when you think about loose leaf ring binders. Numerically, they're probably 75% of the total. Well, this facility up in Chicago made that kind of binder. After I left TAPCO, Sam Hildebrand was in charge of the operation, and he also was made responsible for that facility in Chicago. He moved that facility from Chicago down to Crawfordsville, and for the first time, heat-sealed binders were made here locally. A lot of those people from that plant came with him. As a matter of fact, the Mexican restaurant here on Main Street is run by families of TAPCOs who came down with that facility from Chicago. That facility, the heat sealing vinyl operation, was what TAPCO sold to Vulcan, which was a big customer. In other words, Vulcan made heat sealed binders, and they, in a sense, just took this old Chicago plant out of Crawfordsville and sent it wherever. Because Vulcan has plants in Vulcan, in Vincent, Alabama, and Texas, and various places.
So they're still here.
Yeah, they're still here, and to the extent that the polyethylene operation was what I knew as Crawford Industries, it's still totally here.
Yeah.
I mean, they're doing fine as far as I know.
What do you do with yourself now that you don't have anything to do?
You mean other than this? Well, I've even when I was working, I was active in various organizations here in town, and in the 11 years, now going on 12 that I've been retired, I've been active in the Montgomery County Community Foundation, the Montgomery County Educational Foundation. I've been treasurer of the local Episcopal parish. Played a lot of golf. Played a lot of tennis. Still skied. We've traveled rather extensively.
Huh?
And
Where are some of the places you've been, Jack?
well, we started off going on safari in Africa. Not necessarily in order, but as I remember them. We've been to China, India, New Guinea, and that really stirred some people up here
Why do you ever
when
want to?
Rasher and McGoy heard we were going to New Guinea. They said, why in God's world would anybody want to go to New Guinea? But it was a fascinating trip. We've been to Antarctica, been all over Europe, and been back to England a number of times. I've learned how to drive on the left-hand side of the road over there. Been to South America. Went up the Norwegian coast and back with the Caris's one time. Been to Alaska. I don't know. I mean, I lumped Europe as Europe, but we just got back from a very interesting trip in Italy. Spent a lot of time driving around France and Spain, and so.
What's happened to all your children?
Well, they're all, as I used to say, they're all happily employed. At least they're all employed. I don't know about the other. John, the oldest, is with the Chicago Board of Options Exchange in Chicago. He's a senior vice president of marketing. Paul is a physician in Seattle, and he's an infectious disease specialist. John, incidentally, has 3 children, all girls. Paul has a daughter, Chuck, lives in Chicago, and is a senior programmer with Northern Illinois Gas. He has 2 children, and his wife had a child from a former marriage. Libby, our daughter, lives in Boston and is with Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, director of the capital giving for that institution. And George, the youngest, lives in Seattle, has 2 children. And he married a gal from Seattle whom he met in Connecticut. And if you've ever lived in Seattle, it's almost a given that you're going to go back there someday. So he was persuaded to move back there. And he is with a small company that makes switches and crossovers for railroads and subways and trolley cars and that kind of business. He's an engineer.
Mm-hmm.
Dean has a rather extensive garden, which she thoroughly enjoys, and I work the shovel.
Okay. Well, I think, have we exhausted everything?
Well, probably not, but Dean will probably say when she sees this tape, why didn't you say this or why didn't you say that?
You've been living over on East Jefferson Street for how many years?
Well, we bought our current house on East Jefferson in 1963, and we're still there, and we'll be there as long as we can both go up and downstairs. It has that disadvantage, but it served us very, very well. I think raised 5 children there. So, we have 9 grandchildren. That's usually part of this, isn't it?
Yeah.
And they range in age from 23 to 4.
Right.
So,
Okay.
thank you very much.